Hello, I'm Amanda Herries. I'm a writer and a lecturer, and I've spoken about the subject that I know about all over the world, throughout Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, America, the subjects I know about. I describe myself as a social historian and a decorative arts specialist. People sometimes say to me, "What's that?" My answer is, I know about things which are not fine arts being paintings, drawings, sculpture. And I know about decorative arts objects. It's a huge range of material, and of course I do not know about all of it, but I do know about some quite strange, different groups of materials, which in my mind, I know what the connections are. The story started when I, at the age of 14, wanted to be an archaeologist. I went to university, read archaeology and anthropology, and wanted to get a job in the Museum of London in the archaeological end of its work and its duties, curating the story of London. That didn't happen, and I ended up at the other end of the timeline, you might say, working in the department that was called the Modern Department, running from 1714, slightly arbitrary, but the end of Queen Anne's reign, the end of the Stuart period, to yesterday or this morning or the minute that's just gone. Huge range of time, of stories, of things. The Museum of London was an amalgamation of the London Museum, founded in the early 20s, and the Barbican Museum, the City of London's museum. It was intended that it was specifically to be about the story of London. Unusual for a museum. And that's what makes it, and me, a social history person, place. Under my care and my responsibility were an amazing range of things, from a glorious, huge chest of duelling pistols to swords, to a cupboard full of packaging, Kellogg's cornflake packets, bird's eye custard, toothpaste tube. What's that about? Well, of course, packaging is marketing, advertising, promotion. That changes over time. The imagery, the designs, the colours, the techniques change over time. And that is, of course, an absolutely crucial element of social history in a metropolis, particularly one as big and important as London. I looked after bicycles. I looked after the biggest computer I've ever seen, the first in London, which took up over a room of space. Bit of a headache for us. I looked after glasswares from late 18th century beautiful Jacobite glass to studio glass of the early 20th century. I looked after furniture, I looked after jewellery. I learnt a lot about jewellery. The museum has a very good collection. I even dipped into the Cheapside hoard, which is a little before me, early 17th century, but an extraordinary hoard of jewellery found in London in the early 19th century, and other jewellery in the museum's collection, again, changing tastes and fashions, tell the story of how society changes. Jewellery associated with costume. The costume department in the Museum of London was its own separate entity because it's such an important collection. But of course, with my care of jewellery, I dipped into that as well. No stopping somebody whose interests go far and wide if they're working in a museum, I can tell you. Ceramics were under my care from the early 18th century porcelain figurines, very out of favour nowadays, of created by the Bow and Chelsea porcelain factories in London. We call them factories, thinking of a great big place with dozens of people running about and a hooter. But in fact, there may have been 2 or 3 modelers of the clay, 2 or 3 decorators, 1 or 2 itinerant, and the overseer and the person who did the firing, and maybe 2 rooms. That's all. So those figurines demonstrating enormous skill in the modelling, the painting, the colouring, the mixing of the colours, the firing, extraordinary. I grew to love those pieces and admire them. I didn't have to grow to love the Martin Brothers grotesque bird stoneware, bowls and jars and cigar containers, marvellously beaky things created by the Martin Brothers in the Fulham potteries at the end of the 19th century. So a whole range of material of all sorts. Toys. Toys changed throughout history, and of course toys were made of card and wood, and sometimes clay, and then were made of plastic. Racks full of toys, including dolls' houses, sad stories of life, social history, standing forlorn on their racks. The dolls' houses come from Kensington Palace. Kensington Palace was where the London Museum had first been housed in 2 or 3 rooms when it was first established. Many of you possibly saw them there. Something else strange came from Kensington Palace, a royal residence, of course. Something for which there was no particular explanation. Things that the royal family had or had been given that they didn't really want. And when the London Museum collections moved, they brought some of these things with them. One particular oddity were a group of crown frames for monarchs. George II, huge, heavy, just a skeleton where the diamonds and other stones would have been set, with its red velvet cap of state, of course, but just the skeleton. 2 or 3 of these were in the Museum of London collections, my responsibility. One of the most extraordinary things I did, this is a bit of a sideline, I digress a little, but it's such an amazing story. I was locked up one day with my crown frames, with my colleagues from the Victoria and Albert Museum and the British Museum. Where? In the Jewel House at the Tower of London, on one cold, bitterly cold, wet, grey Saturday in February. And there we were under lock and key, guarded, while we all examined the stones, the precious stones, from material in our collections and compared them with material now in the Jewel House. And we saw where different diamonds, particularly famous diamonds, had sat in different crowns for different monarchs. And we looked at the regalia, held the Star of Africa in my hand, as big as a cricket ball, and had an extraordinary time just analysing the story of these stones, social history. Those frames are now reunited with the more modern frames for bigger or smaller monarchs wanting a slightly more fashionable setting for the stones, perhaps. The stones belonging, of course, to the state, whereas the crown was made for the individual wearer. Something else from those collections from Kensington Palace was a group of about 30 little silver boxes, hinged lids, 2 inches cube, initials and dates on them. Open them up. Bits of crumbly paper, bits of funny little crumbs. Strange, musty smell. After thinking about it for a little bit and looking at the boxes and the dates in which they were made, Not much clue in the records of the time, which was often quite a challenge with those early collections from both those amalgamating museums. I suddenly realised that these were boxes made for pieces of christening cake from Queen Victoria's many children and godchildren. An extraordinary and unique thing, probably will never be put on display, or one or two of them might be. But there they are, and there they should be, in museums. Objects that tell stories and add colour and real life to the pattern of social history. Well, it's quite easy to move from cake to tea. Tea is such a worldwide passion now that we don't even think about where it came from. But tea, the drink of tea, comes from the leaves of the camellia bush. This is a twiglet from the camellia bush outside my back door, sadly rather frosted this year. This is Camellia japonica. The tea we drink comes from the leaves of Camellia sinensis Chinese. Tea is a very fashionable subject to talk about nowadays, and there are dozens of tea tastings everywhere, and as you well know, you can buy any amount of different tea blends and teas, or more strictly speaking, tisanes, made from other things like nettles, chamomile, ginger, turmeric, whatever you like almost, and you will be told that they have medicinal qualities. Tea is what I'm going to talk about, and tea gives me the opportunity to show you 6 objects to give you a quick overview of the tentacles of tea. And that's what I find so fascinating as a social historian about a simple subject like tea. We all drink tea every day. Millions and millions of people drink tea every day. But its tentacles are quite extraordinary. This is Camellia sinensis. My first object is this little Chinese tea bowl. It's thought that tea was being drunk for some sort of medicinal or stimulant effect from 3000 or so BC in China. It's all in the mists of time. Certainly by 10th century BC, it is well recorded as a drink that is drunk throughout China. Tea grows very easily in the climate of China. By the 10th, 11th, 12th century, tea is very well known throughout China, and tea wares are being created specifically for the drinking of this tea. By the 10th century, again, 10th century AD, the great Chinese porcelain kilns at Zhangdezhen in the southwest of the country are beginning to create the most beautiful, fine wares specifically for the drinking of tea, to add, if you like, to this, what is beginning to be a little bit of a ritual of the taking of tea. This isn't a 10th or 11th century tea bowl. It's a late 17th or early 18th century tea bowl. It's blue and white porcelain, very common throughout the regions around China where it could be moved to from the great kilns. We in Europe first started to know something about tea and think it was an interesting and most particularly exotic drink sometime in the 17th century. We learnt it came from China together with quite a number of other things that we in Europe were beginning to find very interesting because we'd never seen them before. Along with tea, porcelain was one of those exotic things. Porcelain was a material we had never seen. We knew nothing about its whiteness, its fineness, its cleanliness, its sheen, the fact that you could decorate it so exquisitely with colours we had not much knowledge of in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. So when we were beginning to establish good trade with China, it wasn't just tea we wanted, it was porcelains, it was other things as well, textiles, some metalwork, but it was most particularly the tea and the porcelains. So here is a little tea bowl specifically made for export. How do I know that? Well, you may or may not be able to see, but this tea bowl, actually the lustre of its surface has got slightly pitted. Very, very slightly. It's just sort of lost its lustre, if you like. It's lost its lustre because it's been at the bottom of the sea for 200 years, and maybe a little bit more. It's part of the cargo that was specifically bringing tea in great quantity and porcelain for everybody in Europe, from Russia to Great Britain, who could possibly get their hands on the tea and the porcelain, and most importantly, of course, who could afford to buy the tea and the porcelain. So here is one of the tentacles: trade, the beginnings of global trade. Before we continue to have an overview of what was going on in Europe, I just want to go back maybe 600 or 700 or 800 years or so to Japan, just for a moment. You couldn't talk about tea without mentioning Japan, could you? Why do I particularly know about Japan? Because after my years at the Museum of London, I then lived in Japan for more than 8 years with my family. And being acquisitive of knowledge and history, I added the Japanese end, if you like, to everything that I began to know about. So here, this is absolutely modern, but here is a typically exquisite Japanese object connected with tea. It's a tea whisk. It's the most beautiful thing, made out of a piece of bamboo, sliced very, very finely to make a natural whisk, if you like. You would use it to whisk into a froth the powdered, vivid green powder that you use, which is green tea, in the tea ceremony. The Japanese don't actually call it the tea ceremony at all. They simply call it cha no yu, water for tea. And in their minds, it's as simple as that. But being Japanese and being, of course, self-isolated from the rest of the world for a period of over 250 years, from the middle of the 17th century towards the late 19th, they developed their ordinary practices into things that were very refined, very stylized, very specific to Japan, with no external influences. So this exquisite tea whisk is simply one of many objects connected with that ritual. The whisk whisks the tea in the special tea bowls. The water is boiled in a special kettle over a special hearth, in a special room, which may be in a special place, a special little tea house, almost certainly in a special tea garden. Everything specifically intending you to cut off whatever your daily business is about and focus inwards and inwards, from the tea garden to the tea room to the scroll telling you what was to be in your mind while you drank the tea, to the special flower arrangement, the ikebana, to the utensils for the tea, beautifully crafted, to the drinking or the tasting of about 3 sips of the matcha, the tea, which I have to tell you is revolting. Always there are dainty little sugars to put straight into your mouth after you have had the matcha, because it's so bitter. That's my second object, which takes me to Japan, Japanese gardens, Japanese culture, all manner of things. Come back to Europe, come back to Britain, where, as the 18th century progresses, tea is what we all want to drink. From those at the top end of society who can afford all sorts of different teas and can afford to pay for the beautiful porcelains that are coming out of China, to those further down society, you might say, who of course also want to drink tea. Why wouldn't they? And they can't afford the porcelains, they can't necessarily afford the tea, but they want to drink it. And so the whole notion of tea drinking expands. But let's stick to the top end for the moment. And here is a little tortoiseshell tea caddy. You keep your tea leaves, of course we're not talking tea bags at all here, in a tea caddy, probably made of a fairly precious material. This is tortoiseshell. And inside it has 2 little compartments. Almost always 2. Why? Because the teas that were coming over to Europe were different types of teas, mostly black teas and green teas. Very, very different process in creating those teas. Black tea is allowed to ferment before it is processed. Green tea is not. It's dried up to a point, but it is not allowed to be fermented over some sort of heating process in a period of days. It is simply dried and then rolled, and therefore there is no chemical change in the leaf that takes place, and you still get this green coloration, if you like, to the tea. The black tea has dried, it's oxidized, it's a slightly different beast, if you like, and it creates black teas. At the time, we had no idea in Europe that both these teas came out of the same bush and off the same leaves. So your caddy would always have had 2 compartments, black and green tea. This is quite simple, but nevertheless a fairly costly item. And look, it has a keyhole. Of course it has a keyhole. Tea was precious, valuable, expensive. You locked it up. You didn't want the servants pilfering it, as indeed they did. You might have had a bigger caddy, which might have had a mixing bowl in it, because you could blend your teas. And of course, at this time, tea wasn't terribly nice. We, of course, in Europe didn't know what it should taste like, so we just had what we got, which I can tell you was quite often adulterated with all sorts of things. That is one of the other stories. It's one of the other tea tentacles, as is the smuggling, as are all sorts of stories of the early hunt for porcelains in this country and throughout Europe. We didn't know what porcelains were. They were expensive. We wanted to copy them. We didn't have the right materials, the raw materials, the clays, the kaolins, whatever was needed. We copied. Finally, we found our own types of porcelain, like the Bow and Chelsea I referred to earlier. But on the way, we made earthenwares and more potteries looking like porcelains. First of all, blue and white, that's what we wanted to copy. But the race was on to find porcelains, to find things that looked like that exotic, Eastern, Oriental, mysterious, must-have material. 18th century caricaturists are well known for their ability to ridicule anything and everything. And here, a little caricature, a fashionable dish of tea in high life. 1774, about the same time as that little tortoiseshell tea caddy. There are two ladies of high life with their absurdly ridiculous hairstyles, another great subject of mirth, which lasted for about 10 years, as hairstyles, cosmetics and all the rest got more and more ridiculous. And the two ladies are drinking tea, chatting. Of course, you never drank tea on your own. Why would you? You'd show off that you had the resources to buy the tea and drink the tea and add all the other things that were increasingly considered necessary for this social activity. So you had the tea table, you had the tea tray, you had the tea kettle, you had teapots, of course. And teapots were made of a number of different materials in the 18th century. You possibly had the servant, possibly from the colonies, providing you, offering you and your guests the tea. Also from the colonies came sugar, another of the great tentacles of this extraordinary development in tea drinking. Because, as I said, we didn't much like the tea. We made it palatable. We put sugar in it, we put milk in it, milk jugs, sugar receptacles, sugar nips, sugar spoons, teaspoons, caddy spoons, caddies of all sorts. They all become part of the accoutrement, absolutely necessary for anybody who wanted to really show off their tea drinking abilities. Tea is drunk throughout British society by the end of the 18th century, possibly in earthenware, tea bowls, increasingly teacups, we'll come on to that, possibly in metal. It didn't matter. We wanted to drink it. The Chinese didn't really want what we could offer in trade for the tea. It didn't take the British, who had of course expanded their colonies from the Caribbean to throughout India and beyond, it didn't take the British long to discover that they did have something in their colonies that the Chinese did want. The Chinese authorities didn't want it, but the Chinese people did, and that was opium. Again, that leads on to another story, the story of the delivery of opium to China from British colonies in India is quite a scandalous one. Yet again, one of those tea tentacles. But going back to tea drinking in this country, earthenwares gives rise to the great expansion of the potteries in the Midlands. They've got the clays, they've got the raw materials. They cannot reproduce porcelain, but they can do a great deal else. And the whole expansion of the potteries, that huge industrialisation of the Midlands, has more than a germ of its origin in the obsession for tea. My second to last object, of course, has to be a silver teapot. You couldn't not have a silver teapot if you were talking about tea. Again, it leads to another story that can be told in connection with tea. You didn't have to drink your tea out of a silver teapot, but it was found that it didn't make any difference to the taste, or we didn't think it did. And it was elegant, it was fashionable, above all, it was expensive, and it demonstrated changing tastes, changing designs, changing fashions, changing styles. So you would never be seen with Granny's teapot, although you might like to have Granny's teapot now, but you would never be seen with Granny's teapot then. You'd have one in the latest style. Our silversmithing records are so very good, unique worldwide, that I can tell you, just by looking at the hallmarks on the bottom of this teapot, exactly which date this teapot was made, where it was made, and indeed who made it. It was made in 1822 in London by a William Bainbridge, who is registered in the London Goldsmiths Company as a maker of tea wares. It's a heavy, ornate style. You'd have something quite different if you moved into the end part of the 19th century. But there you are, silver teapots, an entirely different subject, connected with tea drinking. Finally, I started with a tea bowl. I'm going to end with a teacup and a tea saucer. This is 1920s, 1930s, Booth's real old willow pattern. I haven't yet mentioned the willow pattern. It's essential to tea drinking. Where does it come from? The willow pattern, of course, it's exotic, it's oriental, it's blue and white, but it doesn't come from China. I talked about the expansion of the potteries, the industrialisation. We were, even at the end of the 19th century, we were wanting to copy exotic oriental wares. They went together, if you like, with tea drinking, even though we were beginning to have the confidence to expand into other influences, classical, naturalistic, even abstract up to a point. But towards the end of the 19th century, the potteries, the Midlands towns were creating patterns which took their influences from the Orient and from China, and that included the willow pattern. This was at a time when tea drinking was settling down. We now knew that black teas and green teas came from the same bush. We'd sent an explorer out to China who travelled around for 3 years dressed as a Chinaman illegally and came back with the knowledge that actually it all came from the same place. We had decided we liked the black teas. We liked them with tea and sugar. We'd even decided we liked a handle on our tea bowl. Perhaps it was more refined, more dainty. Perhaps we liked to drink our tea hotter, and so we didn't much like holding it by the rim of the tea bowl itself. Sometime in the late 19th century, or the mid-19th century, the handle appears, and of course the tea saucer. So there we have a 1920s willow pattern invented in England in the late 19th century. Why? To market the tea, to market the potteries, to market the production of the utensils and a whole range of other wares for the table that were being created, and for which the trigger, I might suggest, had been the drinking of tea. So the willow pattern in Britain is purely a marketing exercise, a promotion, an advertising. Children were taught a little rhyme about the willow pattern, a little story to help it on its way. It's English. Its origins are very much Chinese. I'd like to thank you for joining me in this very swift overview of a very ordinary topic, which we don't even think about as we have our tea in our tea mug with our dunking biscuit every day today. But it is full of tentacles, influences, and references to other parts of social history.